So if you would like to say your name for the record,
Yes, my name is Daisun Cohn Williams.
and can you share your experience as a biracial individual in today's society, particularly in light of some of the hate crimes that we've seen? There's been a rise recently. So what has your experience been like?
I think it's interesting because my background is one of African descent and one of Jewish descent. And so one of the big populations that have been dealing with a rise in hate crimes are Jewish people in America. Um, because I'm a Black man in America, those hate crimes, whether it be institutional or individual by private citizens, those are sort of established as a norm at this point. So there wasn't a big shift for me, if that makes sense, right? There's a baseline of being Black. And so around you is a culture of hate and fear and in some ways oppression. So, when Jewish people start dealing with more hate, doesn't affect me. Also, you can hide your Jewishness in ways you can't hide your Blackness as well. What I do think, though, is it gives me a more nuanced and unique perspective on the way that hate operates in America. Um, and in my opinion, just in terms of the way that we as a country are having conversations around that increased hate and what we're doing or not doing about it.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I would say in general, just as a baseline, as a Black man, there are times where you pick up microaggressions throughout your day or your week or your month or your year, or sometimes, unfortunately, you're exposed to something slightly bigger than that. And certainly, as it operates around you and you see it play out, you take that on. Um, but I do think having a makeup that is not just one thing or the other does hopefully innately give you a slightly wider perspective and understanding when you look at what different groups are going through.
Absolutely. So it's being able to have that perspective and knowledge of this is a lived experience, despite if you see an uptick in hate crime incidents, it's a lived reality to experience people reacting to you because of your blackness or racial makeup.
Absolutely. And even when it's not a daily thing one-on-one, when you see the way people in the news or pundits react or people interviewed, or you see, larger groups of people protesting or whatever is going on in the larger national and international kind of world, it does affect you, right? If you're a human being who's has empathy and awareness, it affects you. But when you know that it's similar things that happen to you or could happen to you, it affects you even more. So, the ideal is that you are aware of it. It's sad that it exists, but the ability to recognize it, I was always taught, was really important as well for your own safety, right? But there is that other part of it as well where, it's a burden that you have to carry with you, that perspective.
Interesting. And absolutely, I hear just in terms of how your background has influenced your perspective on social events and what is happening, social and current events. So I'm sure that includes um, economic, political, um, just what's happening in terms of those landscapes. And how has your background influenced your perspective on civil rights issues? I mean, of course, we talk about the news, but in terms of just the systemic issues that
Mhm.
biracial individuals face.
Well, I definitely want to do that, but you brought up something that just, if I can,
Please.
reminded the economic piece. And obviously, there's a whole world of the economic piece in the macro and micro level. But I'm reminded of something several years ago that started happening, where my father would, be watching television in New York. He would call me, and he would say, so I'm watching CNBC. When are we going to build this generational wealth? And I always thought that was kind of, it's amusing in one way. It's sad in another way, right? Because, here's a man who's in his 70s asking his son that, and his son is like, I wish you had figured that out before, you know? And I
Yeah.
think that is a component as well, right? When it comes to economics of race, it's what do we have access to? How are we educated on certain things? The average white family has a different education on economics than the average Black family or Latino family, et cetera. Why is that? So there's so many different facets that sort of play out where I have friends now because now we have more access through the internet and social media and YouTube and, you know, education where they've got their children set up, already for the future in a way that our parents never had any understanding of that, right? But there are friends that I have whose parents set them up, and they were not usually the Black kids or the Hispanic kids or even the biracial kids.
Mhm.
So I think the economics piece is an interesting part there, and that's just obviously one little thing. In terms of civil rights and the perspective of growing up
I
biracial,
wanted to make one point.
yeah,
I think that education certainly influences access to resources, especially that economic education. So I think that it's great that you described what the disparity looks like there in contrast to um, white um, white families and black families and just diverse families.
yeah, and I can tell you, I had an opportunity to leave New York in high school and do a couple years at a boarding school in Massachusetts, and it was really interesting going to school with some of the 1% of the world economically, right? Um, and specifically some of the white American kids, right? Who, for the most part, and I think it's a generational thing as well, were, if they weren't aware, they weren't actively, at the very least, trying to hurt other people that were different than them or, push them to the side and segregate them. So that's something, right? Now these were a lot of newer money kids, so it might be the difference there too in international kids. But you saw the way that things operated for them, both in terms of their understanding of certain things and where they've gone since then, along
Mhm.
pathways that were sort of laid out for them if they wanted it. And
Mhm.
at the school, you also saw for some of them who were dealing with a little bit more emotional turmoil, you saw what they were able to get away with
Mhm.
and what they were even willing to entertain as, behavior, right? Because they knew they'd be okay. You steal your dorm head's car and you race it around campus, you might get kicked out, but you're going to be okay. So there's so many interesting pieces there. These kids, that's a totally different type of education. They're educated in their privilege as well, right? Whereas there were other kids there who were educated in their lack of privilege, and they were seeing privilege at the same time. And I think it was very informative.
That's very interesting and very nuanced as well. So thank you for sharing that. Like you think about the starting line between black and white kids and also being between those worlds and the fact that there are very clear messages that are communicated about how you navigate in that space and then that being a microcosm of a bigger just an even bigger experience.
Absolutely. And I will say one last thing on this. There was an interesting moment. I think this was the late 90s. So there was an attempt starting to examine certain issues in schools that were not perhaps examined in the past. And at this boarding school in particular, I think they were a little bit better about those things back then. Whatever that means, you know. Um, and there was a day in the dorm where they had I think they were trying to create sort of an understanding of and racial empathy for everybody. And they asked people to break up into groups that they identified with.
Mhm.
And I already knew that I was going to sort of be in two different groups. There was going to be the multiracial group, and there was going to be the Black group, the African American group, or the Black group, because we had African students as well. Um, and so I went over first to the multiracial group, and to get a vibe. And there was a blonde woman who was 1/16th Tahitian, right? So she put herself there. There was a white man who I remember asking him, I didn't know, like, why are you here? And he said, well, I grew up in Philly, like, on the same block as Black people. So, and it was really interesting, and then obviously I went over to sit in the Black group, which is where I felt comfortable at that time anyway. But I think what was really interesting was, the lack of education around race, around ethnicity, identity, um, that was happening there in a different way than it would have a few decades before. I think a few decades before it would have been very clear cut. It just would have been like he would never have even thought to do that. And I don't know if it's culturally things were changing. I don't know if it was hip hop. I don't know, whatever it was. Some of these, there was confusion there, right? But it wasn't necessarily bad confusion. It was an attempt to try to empathize and sympathize, but also it missed a lot of, all of these things that we're talking about, nuance of experience that comes with it, whether you're in the multiracial group or you're in the African American group, it missed those things. So
Mhm.
that was a really interesting anecdote that I've never forgotten, because I think that we still have so much confusion and lack of clarity around race, racial theory, right? Ethnicities, first nationalities, how these things play out in different communities, access to education, privilege, all of these things. There's not a really cohesive understanding in this country for many people. And that's why we get into a lot of these political debates. And, I think obviously there's people that have their agendas, but for the average American, and the average white American, let's say, who can't wrap their head around some of these things, it's because it's not clear. It's not been taught. The stories have not been shown in the multitude, on television and the movies that's just starting, where you see,
Mhm.
more variety of experiences. So people continue on with their stereotypes, and we don't have these conversations in honest enough ways, unfortunately.
In what ways do you believe sharing your personal narrative can contribute to that broader conversation on civil rights and racial equality?
Yes, okay, there's a bunch there. Well, I think there's two pieces, right? There's one that with people of multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial backgrounds, especially when they're younger, it can be hard,
Mhm.
right? Unless they seem very clearly, that they fit in one group or the other. And even then it's hard because they have to find a way to negotiate being with just one group and still perhaps honoring the other parent or the other, other nuanced parts of their experience that are not so specific and unique to one group or the other, you know? And it creates a lot of emotional distress for a lot of young people. I work with young people. So I am a teen and family success coach and mentor. So, I see the way that a million different scenarios play out for teenagers and for preteens. And for multicultural, multiracial kids, where do I fit in is a common theme. And I think it's a theme that's shifting because just the number of, multicultural marriages and children have grown so exponentially over the decades, where, the new census is starting now. We have no idea what it's going to be at the end of it, but it's probably going to see, an extreme uptick again, just like in 2020. So I think that is enabling a little bit less of this identity fracture, stress. And, kids have access to Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat. And, I think there's a little bit more um, open-mindedness that they're being allowed to have, also about gender and all of those things. So that's great. But it's also, I think, important to hear the stories of people that came before you and what they experienced and how they navigated it. Because there are moments where and when it is very hard to navigate situations where you don't feel like you fit in. And for teenagers and preteens, there's a million different reasons why you might feel like you don't fit it. Maybe you're neurodivergent, you have ADHD, maybe you're gay, whatever it is. But certainly we know when it's skin deep, it's visible, right? And so it's more accessible right away. And so are the divisions that could come up amongst people. So I think it's important to share stories with young people. I mean, that's part of my world, right? It's helping them see paths forward and knowing that they're not alone, right? So that's one part. I think the other piece is you mentioned civil rights. I was raised on my dad's back and my mom's back in marches and protests. So, I have a unique experience with that where my parents were always very involved. So I was involved from, a very young age. I think for me, being that I come from two extraordinarily oppressed groups, uh, I see the world very clearly in terms of those with power and without power, and I see how it plays out, right? And I understand the risks that we all, what are the risks of having people in power that preach extreme ideas? Well, the risk is that your people could be wiped off the face of the planet, or your people could be put in chains, or so we know that, those risks are there where someone else might be like, oh, that could never happen. I'm like, well, no, we've seen it, right? I've lost family here, or I have a history of, oppression and trauma that's been passed down through my family line. So it's real. I think the other thing it offers me is the perspective outside of the group, right? So, I think you talked about the uptick in hate crimes right now. Yes, there is an uptick in hate crimes right now, which we don't always talk about depending on what the group is. So, hate bad, hate crimes bad. And the also to widen the perspective is something that I always think is important. And it's more relevant right now than it ever has been with different wars going on in the world and, some of the politics that are coming up. So for me, coming from two different groups, seeing perspectives from different groups, but also being rooted in a social justice orientation and the desire for all people to find equity and equality and peace and the opportunity to have peace and to not have to look over their shoulders and pass down trauma to their generations that come after that is very central to my life and my work.
Absolutely. And I think in terms of your work, I mean, you're working with families and children to shape them in their formative years. These are very crucial years of development and developing a self concept. And
Mhm.
just hearing about your own experience navigating that and what you hope your story can bring to the conversation, I think is profound in the sense that there is an experience when you are between two worlds
Mhm.
and there's a certain level of strength that needs to be present in order to navigate strength and knowledge. um and I say strength and maybe that isn't the word,
Mhm.
so I'll let you put it into, I'll let you articulate that, but I guess how have you overcome the challenges that you faced, and how do you think that could be maybe something that another young person takes away from hearing this in
Mm.
being a biracial individual?
Yeah, it's interesting because growing up in the 80s and the 90s, some things haven't changed, some things are much different, obviously. And I remember at one point my mother, go collect for UNICEF with my elementary school or something. And there was definitely an age where my mom was like, okay, when you go do this, you got to go out with one of your white friends to do it. Don't do it by yourself. Don't go with one of your black friends, right? Because as I started aging, and even probably before that, it's, oh, this kid's just trying to make money for himself, right? As opposed to this 10-year-old is trying to raise money for kids that are starving across the world. And that's what happens, especially if you're in whiter communities, right? So for me, I was sort of raised to remember, what I look like. And because I was darker than, a lot of people around me, I pushed towards the melanin, right? So I was, you are black. If race is a social construct used for identification, at the very least, you better know how you're being identified for your own safety. Okay. So that was how I was raised. And it wasn't to dismiss my mom. She said the same thing, and she still would take me to the synagogue for high holy days and stuff. It wasn't that I lost that cultural component. It was just that I recognized and understood where the racial component lay, right? And I think that is important because we're talking about race, we're talking about ethnicity and culture. We're talking about we're talking about religion in some ways for some people, nationalities, so there's so many different pieces there. I think, with multicultural, multiracial Americans, what's great is that there are, even though things might not always be as extreme today, although I would argue if you look black, you better understand what that means as we try to change the reality around that. What I love about multiracial Americans is they're creating community to have these conversations, right? Because imagine you are a white mom or a white dad, right? And you're in a multiracial relationship, marriage, whatever, and you have a child. And let's say you're black or Asian or you're Latin or Native American, whatever passes away, right? Early on. And now you're raising this kid, you know we've seen it in movies like how do I do your hair, and the girl, but like beyond that, right, where is the support that can also help you navigate what it means to be a white parent of a black kid, for example? And so you have a community through multiracial Americans, which is amazing because all of these families create support systems for each other, for education and resources, emotional support, right, advocating for their kids and for people in general. I think it's a great place to begin because if you begin by really supporting those communities who are at the forefront of evolution in a way, right? As societies become more open and mix more, these are the people that will continue to grow and be the face of a society, right? As the old norms disappear and the restrictions and the rules disappear and the hate disappear. So you start there, then you are starting at a place that innately is a bastion of inclusion and acceptance and diversity. And in this way, communication, because it's necessary in order to help your kids grow up feeling supported, confident, not constantly questioning themselves, not feeling out of place, and not a place to segregate because it's an expansive kind of community. So I think they're doing amazing things. And that's why I love being in connection with them and working with them. I think we're talking about now, we're talking about doing some college workshops and teen workshops for kids that are going through these different things in the community. Um, so that's been wonderful. That's part of your question. It's a big question. You know,
No, and you answered that really well. And I think that I really appreciate the emphasis on younger generations. The children are the future of what it looks like to build a community that is inclusive, understanding of the experiences of multiracial individuals, and just those from other walks of life. There doesn't have to be this unknown. We can cultivate spaces which the multi racial Americans um, organization is doing. And it doesn't have to feel like this overwhelming thing. You know, we can show up and just show up with the best of intentions and also just paying it forward, right? Like, I think that that's a big part of this conversation, and it's what it's about. I think
Yeah,
that's history. Uh,
absolutely. And these experiences, listen, if you have a racist person in your family, for example, the easiest way to get them to rethink things is to show up with a grandson or a granddaughter that doesn't look like them. Now, for some people, especially in the past, they'll be sent away, but you got a better chance of getting grandpa to soften up and realize maybe he wasn't on point when you present a baby, a child, and you see it play out. Again and again, you talk to people that have had children, white people that have had children, people from other races, they always say the same thing, right? Something changes, something softens because the I'm not like you is gone. So, in that way, multiracial people serve as a potential bridge of all different types of people coming together. And again, that's why I think it's not that I think they deserve more focus economically from the government. No, but it's a great place to look to when you're looking to see hope for the future and for change.
what's the importance of preserving stories like this within an archive with the Civil Rights Institute and the NCSU San Bernardino?
Yeah, thanks. Um, I was a history teacher. So for years back in New York and in Boston. So history is important to me in general. I think, it's something that I look at as the missing component in America, that there's less of an emphasis on really understanding where we came from and why we came from there. And how do we get away from some of those things and learn from them? And what are the things that we need to not, let go of? So preserving people's stories, people's unique experiences, their truths, I think is incredibly important. And for most of us, the truths and the stories that are preserved are only preserved for the most famous people, the political leaders, they're not for the everyday people. Most history books don't have, what was Mariah's experience? What was Daisun's experience? Very few. I think Howard Zinn's with People's History of the United States might be exclusive in that, or one of the few. So listen, things change and people forget, and the stories of the past that we can learn from disappear. And so anytime we have the chance to archive it and make it accessible to other people, it's important because we can learn from those things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jason.